clay tablet, roughly the size of a human palm, sits in the British Museum under low-glass light. Pressed into its surface are rows of small wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform, recording the count of sheep belonging to a temple in southern Mesopotamia, dated to around 3000 BC. The scribe who shaped those marks worked in heat that could climb past 49 degrees. He pressed a cut reed into wet clay, and the clay dried, and the record survived. 5,000 years later, we can still read his tally. What kind of people leave their bookkeeping behind, but almost nothing of their own beginning? The Sumerians are often called the people who started civilization. It is a large claim, and like most large claims, it asks for patience more than certainty. Tonight we'll follow their traces not through grand declarations, but through what the ground still holds, the irrigation canals that made their cities possible, the tablets that carried their words forward, and the massive step temples they raised toward gods who they believed lived just beyond the reach of the sky. These are the pieces. Whether they mark a true beginning or simply the earliest one we can read is a question worth keeping open as we go. Southern Mesopotamia is flat. Not gently flat, severely flat. A landscape of silt and clay stretching between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, that behave nothing like the predictable Nile. These rivers flood when they choose. Some years the water rises and drowns entire settlements. Other years the rivers barely swell at all. Occasionally a river simply shifts its course, wandering miles from where it ran the season, before leaving a city that once sat along its bank stranded in open dust. And yet, sometime around 6,000 years ago, people chose to stay here. Not just stay, build. Roughly 20 city-states rose across this plain, each one centered on a towering mud brick structure called a ziggurat, each one dependent on a network of hand-dug canals that carried river water to fields of barley and onion and date palm. The system required constant labour. Silt filled the channels. Banks eroded. A single season of neglect could mean failed crops, and failed crops in this climate meant death not as metaphor but as arithmetic. Here is a detail that may say more than any monument. Among the thousands of clay tablets recovered from Sumerian sites, a surprising number are not religious hymns or royal inscriptions. They are receipts. Grain measured out for canal workers, beer rations tallied by the jar. One tablet from the city of Ur records the distribution of barley to individual labourers, name by name, amount by amount, for a single month of ditch clearing. The accountant who pressed those marks into wet clay may not have considered himself part of anything historic. He was solving a logistics problem, but what he left behind suggests something about the scale of organised effort these cities demanded, and the degree to which survival here was not individual but collective. This is where the story of Sumer becomes both familiar and strange. The people who dug those canals also mapped constellations. They divided circles into 360 degrees and hours into 60 minutes conventions. We still carry inherited from a counting system based on finger segments rather than whole fingers. They brewed beer, thick, unfiltered drunk through reed straws to avoid the sediment, and considered it not a luxury but a staple, safer than the river water that carried what the rivers carried. A goddess named Ninkali presided over the craft, and a hymn sung in her honour doubled, it seems, as a recipe. They developed writing, or rather writing developed itself out of their need to count things. Small clay tokens representing sheep or grain gave way to impressions pressed into soft clay, which gave way to pictures, which gave way to symbols standing for sounds rather than objects. By the time the system matured, a trained scribe could set down anything that could be spoken, legal codes, medical prescriptions, love poetry, a student's bitter list of all the times he was struck in a single school day. But learning those symbols, perhaps 600 in common, use each carrying multiple meanings depending on context, required years of study in temple schools, where patience was enforced by the back of a hand. Their gods numbered in the thousands if we count every local spirit and field deity. The major ones and Enlil Enki Inanna governed skystorm water, and the tangled ground where love and war seemed to share a border. The temples that served these gods functioned as far more than houses of prayer. They were granaries, courts of law schools, and administrative centres. The priests who managed them controlled grain distribution, organised canal labour, settled disputes, diagnosed illness, and recorded everything every animal born, every jar of oil, stored every debt owed. It was in a sense the first bureaucracy operating under divine license. And yet this civilization, for all its invention, carried within it the tensions that would eventually wear it thin. The same irrigation that fed the cities may have slowly poisoned the soil with salt. Some scholars argue this others weigh additional causes. The same canals that demanded cooperation between city-states also became sources of conflict, when one city diverted water upstream and another went dry. Wars between neighbours were frequent close, and fought largely by conscripted farmers, handed spears they barely knew how to hold. Empires rose. Sargon of Akkad built what appears to be the first stretching from the Persian Gulf toward the Mediterranean, and empires collapsed sometimes to mountain peoples who conquered the land but could not maintain the systems that kept it alive. Much of what survives comes to us through later hands. Babylonian scribes copied Sumerian texts centuries after the language stopped being spoken in the streets. An Assyrian king named Ashurbanipal, ruling around 650 BC, more than 1,000 years after Sumer's political end, sent agents across Mesopotamia to gather and duplicate ancient tablets for his library at Nineveh. When archaeologists opened that library in the 19th century, they found the Sumerian world still legible, still waiting in dried clay. Tonight, we move through that world slowly. We begin where a day began in the heat, before dawn, on a reed mat pressed against packed earth, with the sound of a city stirring along the canals. And we follow the hours forward through the labour and the ritual, the marketplace and the temple stairs. The small ordinary moments that layered together became something no one had quite built before. Before the sun. The air inside a Sumerian house at the edge of dawn carries a particular weight. Not the weight of moisture, this is southern Mesopotamia, and the climate here is merciless in its dryness, but something closer to the weight of stillness, the kind that settles into mud brick walls a foot thick and lingers there, holding the last coolness the night was willing to give. The floor is packed earth. The mat beneath you is woven reed, and its pattern has pressed itself into your back through the hours, ridge by ridge, knot by knot, until your skin has memorized the grid better than your hands ever could. There is no mattress. The Sumerian language, for all its thousands of cuneiform signs, does not appear to contain a word for one. This is a detail that seems small, and perhaps it is, but it returns in the archaeological record with a quiet insistence that is hard to dismiss. The houses excavated across southern Mesopotamia at Ur, at Uruk, at Eridu, at dozens of smaller sites, share a remarkably consistent layout. Thick mud brick walls, a central courtyard open to the sky, sleeping rooms that open onto that courtyard. Almost no windows, and where openings exist they sit high near the ceiling, narrow, designed to release trapped heat rather than admit light. The architecture is not decorative. It is defensive against the sun, against dust storms, against temperatures that in high summer may reach 49 degrees Celsius and remain above 40 for weeks without relief. Every design choice in these houses is a negotiation with heat, and the heat, it seems, won most of those negotiations. You wake in near darkness. Grey light traces the gaps in the reed walls, but inside the room shapes are indistinct. The sound reaches you before the light does. Footsteps in the courtyard, the scrape of a clay vessel being moved, voices low and unhurried. A city is waking, though. Waking may be too generous a word. It is stirring reluctantly, the way any settlement stirs when the work ahead is certain and the rest behind was insufficient. Someone has started a fire. You can hear the soft crackle of fuel catching dried reeds, animal dung, whatever was gathered and stored. Smoke drifts upward through the open courtyard, carrying with it the faint smell of the cooking to come. Breakfast, when it arrives, is barley. It is almost always barley. The grain is boiled in water until it softens into a thick porridge, and it is eaten without ceremony from a clay bowl with your fingers. If your household has honey, a bit is stirred in. If there are dates, they appear on the side. If there is nothing extra, and for most people most mornings there is nothing extra, the porridge is eaten plain. Alongside it, or shortly after, there may be a piece of flatbread. The dough is simple barley flour water, a pinch of salt pressed thin and slapped against the inner wall of a heated clay oven, where it bakes in minutes, emerging slightly charred at the edges, and warm enough to steam when you tear it. And then there are onions. There are always onions. The Sumerian diet, as far as the record can reconstruct it, leans on onions with a devotion that borders on dependency. Onions raw, onions, roasted onions, with every meal onions as a flavouring and a staple, and presumably a persistent fact of communal life that everyone has long since stopped noticing. Your throat is dry. It has been dry since sometime in the night, and the clay jar in the corner of the room holds only a small reserve of water that tastes of minerals and the vessel itself, that earthy, slightly metallic flavour that clings to everything stored in clay. You drink sparingly. Water in Sumer is not scarce in the way of a true desert. The Tigris and Euphrates are close, their channels visible from the city walls, but the distance between water that exists and water that is safe to drink is considerable. The rivers carry silt, waste the runoff from upstream settlements. Animals drink from them. People wash in them. The priests may frame the danger in terms of gods dwelling in the current, but the practical reality is simpler. Untreated river water makes people sick, and sickness here without antibiotics, without any germ theory, without much beyond herbal pastes, an incantation can end a life as efficiently as any blade. So you ration. You wait for water that has been carried to the communal well, allowed to settle, distributed in measured amounts. The system works not generously, not comfortably, but it works. It keeps people alive in a landscape that seems at first glance designed to do the opposite. Outside, the sky is opening. That thin pre-dawn grey is lifting towards something brighter, and the stars visible here with a clarity that no modern city can match. The Milky Way, a pale band overhead in a sky unbroken by artificial light, or any structure taller than 2 stories, are beginning to fade. The courtyard is filling with your household. Parents, siblings, perhaps a spouse, perhaps children. Sumerian families live in layers, multiple generations sharing the same walls, the same courtyard, the same cooking fire. Privacy as a concept does not appear to have arrived yet. Everyone sees everyone. Everyone hears everyone. The space is shared entirely, and within it the morning unfolds along lines so familiar they barely require thought. Then the sound comes. A gong, low and resonant, carrying from the centre of the city from the direction of the structure. You can see from anywhere the ziggurat, the step temple tower rising above every rooftop, every wall, every other building in the settlement. The gong is a summons. It means work. And in Sumer, work means one thing above all others. The canals are waiting. The water and the work. What held a Sumerian city together was not its walls, not its ziggurat, not its king or its priests or its laws. What held it together was mud. Mud shaped into bricks and dried in the sun to build every structure. Mud lining the floors of every house, mud forming the banks of every canal, and mud wet, heavy silted, endless, filling those canals day after day, season after season, requiring an effort of removal so constant and so collective that if it stopped for even a short while, the consequences were not political or economic in some abstract sense, but lethal in the most direct one. No functioning canals meant no water reaching the fields. No water meant no barley, no onions, no flax, no feed for livestock. No harvest meant no rations, and no rations meant starvation, not as a risk to be managed, but as a certainty to be outrun every single day by the work of human hands, scooping silt from channel beds under a sun that did not care whether the work was finished. The irrigation network that sustained southern Mesopotamia was by any measure an extraordinary achievement. Canals branched from the Tigris and Euphrates in wide arterial channels, then split into smaller distributary ditches, then narrowed further into field-level furrows that delivered water directly to the roots of planted crops. Reservoirs stored surplus water for dry stretches. Dikes and levees controlled the flow during flood season, which in this river system arrived not with the gentle predictability of the Nile, but with a violence that could vary wildly from one year to the next. Some years the rivers barely rose. Other years the floodwaters came fast and high enough to destroy entire sections of canal, wash away embankments, drown livestock, and leave fields submerged under brown water, thick with debris. The rivers themselves occasionally shifted course not by inches but by miles, abandoning the infrastructure that had been built along their former banks and leaving settlements stranded in dry earth, with no water source at all. To live here required not just engineering skill, but a tolerance for uncertainty that most modern infrastructure planners would find unbearable. You pass through the city gate into the light, and the landscape beyond the walls opens in a grid of green and brown that stretches toward the horizon. The fields are orderly barley and wheat, in rows date palms and clusters providing shade and fruit, vegetable plots dense with onion and garlic and cucumber. Between the fields, the canals cut dark lines through the earth, some carrying water that glints in the early sun, others half dry and clogged with the pale residue of silt that has settled overnight. An overseer is already at the work site shouting assignments, pointing crews toward different sections. He reports to the NC, the city's administrative and religious leader. The NC reports in theory to the gods. Everyone in Sumer reports to someone, and the chain of obligation runs upward until it disappears into the divine, which is a convenient arrangement for those near the top and a relentless one for those at the bottom. Your assignment today is a section of canal where the water has slowed to something barely moving, a thick, reluctant current that is not delivering enough volume to the fields beyond. The cause is silt, always silt packed into the channel bed in layers that compact under their own weight and narrow the waterway until flow becomes a trickle. The tool in your hand is a wooden shovel, broad and flat, its edge worn smooth by use. You step into the canal. The water is knee-deep, warm, murky. Your feet sink into the soft bottom. You begin to dig, scooping silt into a basket that another worker carries to the embankment and dumps. The motion is simple. Scoop, lift, load, return, and it repeats without variation for hours. The silt is heavier than it looks, dense with moisture, and fine clay particles that cling to the shovel, to your hands, to your forearms. Within minutes, your back begins to register what it already knows from years of this same motion, a deep ache between the shoulder blades that never fully goes away, that has become so ordinary you no longer think of it as pain, but simply as the feeling of being alive in Sumer. The heat builds steadily. By mid-morning, the air shimmers above the canal banks, and the sun presses against your back and shoulders with a weight that feels almost physical, as though the light itself has density. Sweat appears and evaporates almost simultaneously, leaving a fine crust of salt on your skin that itches and tightens as the morning progresses. Around you, hundreds of other workers do the same thing, men and women both, and older children who have been brought to carry baskets or clear smaller channels. Someone begins a work song, rhythmic and repetitive, a melody that matches the cadence of digging and helps synchronize the movements of a crew working in close quarters. The lyrics, when you catch them, mention the gods, the harvest, the hope that this season will be better than the last. Hoping, it seems, is a technology the Sumerians rely on almost as heavily as the shovel. There is a fact embedded in this daily labour that is easy to overlook but difficult to overstate. The canal system required not just physical effort but coordination on a scale that had no precedent in human experience. Thousands of workers needed to be organised, fed, tracked and directed across dozens of simultaneous work sites spread over miles of landscape. Someone had to decide which canal section needed repair first, how many workers to assign, how much water to divert while maintenance was underway, how to distribute rations to crews working far from the city. This was not a task that could be managed by memory or informal agreement. It required records, written records, detailed and specific, and it is no coincidence that the earliest known writing in human history emerges not from poetry or myth or royal declaration, but from exactly this kind of administrative need. The first cuneiform tablets are not stories, they are lists. Grain-measured workers counted beer rations tallied. The invention that would eventually carry the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Laments for Fallen Cities began as a bookkeeping tool for canal logistics. And there is something in that origin, something humble and pragmatic, and quietly profound that says as much about the Sumerians as any monument they built. By midday, the gong sounds again from the city and the work stops. Not because the canal is finished, the canal is never finished, but because the heat has crossed a threshold, beyond which labour becomes not just painful, but dangerous. You set down the shovel. Your hands are blistered over calluses, your shoulders locked in a posture of soreness that will take hours to release. The walk back to the city is slow, heavy, the sun directly overhead now casting almost no shadow. The walls of the city absorb the heat and hold it radiating warmth back into streets that feel less like passages and more like the inside of a kiln. But the canal behind you is flowing better than it was at dawn, and the fields beyond it will receive water today, and the barley in those fields will continue to grow toward a harvest that will keep the city alive for another season. That is the calculation. That is the contract Sumer has made with its landscape, a contract paid in labour renewed every morning and never for as long as these cities stand fully settled. And yet the canals are only part of what the temple manages. Somewhere inside the ziggurat complex, in rooms cooler than anything outside, scribes are pressing reeds into wet clay recording today's work. Alongside yesterday's and the day before, that building an archive that neither they nor anyone else yet understands will outlast every wall in the city. The house that reached. How tall does a building need to be before it stops being architecture and becomes a statement? In southern Mesopotamia, where the land is flat enough that a person standing on a rooftop can see for miles in every direction, the answer arrived in the form of a structure that had no practical reason to exist at the height it reached. The ziggurat, a stepped pyramid of mud brick, rising from the centre of every major Sumerian city, climbed as high as 150 feet above the plain. Its base covered roughly 3 acres. Its construction required millions of individual bricks, decades of labour, and a quantity of organised effort that makes the daily canal work look almost modest by comparison. And at its summit, accessible only to the high priest or priestess, sat a single small temple, painted blue to mirror the sky, as though the entire massive structure beneath it existed for no other purpose than to lift one room a little closer to where the gods were believed to dwell. The ziggurat was not a tomb. It was not a fortress. It stored no grain housed, no army sheltered, no population during flood or siege. Its function, as far as the record suggests, was entirely vertical, a bridge between the human world below and the divine world above, built on the assumption that the gods lived at elevation, and that if human beings could not travel to the sacred mountains where divinity resided, they could at least construct a mountain of their own, and hope the gesture was noticed. Whether the gods noticed is of course beyond the reach of archaeology. What the record does show is that the people of Sumer behaved as though the gods were always watching, always hungry, always one missed offering away from sending drought or disease or military defeat, and that this belief shaped every aspect of daily life with a thoroughness that is difficult to exaggerate. The courtyard surrounding the ziggurat served as the civic heart of the city, a vast open space perhaps the size of 10 modern city blocks, where public life unfolded in all its variety. Markets operated along its edges, legal disputes were heard there, religious festivals filled it with music and procession. Public announcements carried from the ziggurat's lower platforms across the gathered crowd, and executions when they occurred took place in the same space where children played and merchants haggled, because in Sumer the sacred and the administrative and the brutal occupied the same ground without apparent contradiction. The temple complex that radiated outward from the ziggurat's base was not merely a place of worship. It functioned as the city's central institution part, granary part, courthouse part, school part, hospital part, bank. The priests who managed it controlled the storage and distribution of grain, organised the labour crews for canal maintenance, settled property disputes, diagnosed illness through a combination of symptom observation and omen reading, and maintained an archive of written records so extensive that some modern scholars have compared the operation to a corporation, though one whose board of directors claimed to take instructions directly from the divine. The priesthood itself occupied the second tier of Sumerian social hierarchy, just below the Ensi and his family, and their authority derived from a simple and powerful claim they could communicate with the gods. They read omens in the patterns of oil poured on water in the shape of a sheep's liver after sacrifice, in the movements of stars and planets tracked over generations of careful observation. They performed the rituals that kept divine anger at bay, or attempted to, and when disaster struck, despite those rituals, they offered explanations rooted in the logic of divine displeasure. A flood meant someone had sinned. A plague meant offerings had been insufficient. A military defeat meant a rival city's patron god had proven stronger at least temporarily than your own. The system was internally consistent in a way that made it nearly impossible to disprove from within, and it kept the priesthood at the centre of power for centuries, because if every misfortune was ultimately a religious failure, then the people best equipped to address it were conveniently the priests themselves. Among the thousands of gods the Sumerians recognized, and the number may reach 3,000 if one counts every local spirit-filled deity and minor protective figure 4 stood above the rest, and the sky god occupied the theoretical summit of the pantheon, but appears in the texts as largely passive, a retired authority whose name carried weight, but whose direct intervention was rare. Enlil, god of air and storms, held the operative power, the god most feared, most frequently invoked, most blamed when things went wrong. His temple at Nippur made that city the religious capital of Sumer, regardless of which city held political dominance at any given time. Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, appears in the myths as cleverer and more sympathetic than his peers, the deity who warned a man named Ziusudra to build a boat before a great flood, a narrative that predates the more familiar biblical version by perhaps 1,000 years, though the relationship between the two traditions remains a subject of careful scholarly discussion, rather than settled fact. And then there was Inanna, goddess of love and war simultaneously, whose mythology is among the most vivid and complex in the Sumerian corpus. A deity who descends to the underworld, dies, returns, and sends her own husband to take her place among the dead, in a cycle of stories that resist simple interpretation and have generated more academic commentary than almost any other Sumerian text. What held this theological architecture together was not faith in the modern sense, not personal belief chosen freely, but something closer to infrastructure. The gods were part of the operating system. You did not choose to believe in Enlil any more than you chose to believe in the river. He was simply there embedded in the calendar, the harvest cycle, the legal code, the explanation for why your child fell ill or your canal breached its bank. To question the gods was not heresy in the dramatic sense. It was more like questioning gravity, not forbidden exactly, but so far outside the framework of ordinary thought that it barely occurred to anyone to try. And yet the priest did more than pray. Inside those cool stone rooms at the ziggurat's base, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with gods, and everything to do with reed styluses pressed into wet clay marks by careful mark, building a system that would carry human thought further than any temple could reach. Marks in wet clay. A reed cut at an angle and no longer than a finger pressed into a surface of clay that has been moistened just enough to accept an impression without crumbling, that is all it took. The gesture is so simple that a child could perform it, and in fact children did thousands of them year after year, sitting cross-legged in the shaded courtyards of temple schools, pressing their practice signs into cheap tablets that would be smoothed over with a wet rag and reused the moment a teacher judged the work inadequate. The tool left a mark shaped like a small wedge triangular at the point of entry, tapering where the reed was lifted away, and from that wedge, repeated and rotated and combined in patterns of increasing complexity, emerged the first writing system in recorded history. The Latin word for wedge is cuneus, and from it we take the name cuneiform, though the Sumerians themselves had no single word for what they had created. To them it was simply the way things were set down, the method by which the world's business was tracked and stored and made retrievable across time. The origins of that method are not dramatic. They are, if anything, tediously practical, which may be part of why they matter so much. Sometime around 5,000 years ago, temple officials in southern Mesopotamia faced a problem that had nothing to do with literature or philosophy, or the preservation of culture. They needed to count things. Specifically, they needed to know how many sheep belonged to the temple flock, how much grain sat in storage, who had paid their obligations and who had not. The solution was a system of small clay tokens, 1 token per sheep, 1 token per unit of grain, stored in clay containers that could be sealed and counted when disputes arose. It worked, but it was cumbersome. A flock of 300 sheep required 300 tokens, and storing them required space, and verifying them required breaking the seal each time, and the whole arrangement was fragile in ways that created more problems than it solved. Then someone, and we do not know who, and likely never will, had the idea of pressing the tokens into the surface of a soft clay tablet before sealing them away, creating a visible record on the outside that matched the contents within. The tokens themselves became redundant almost immediately. Why store physical objects when their impressions carried the same information in a fraction of the space? From impressions of tokens, the system moved to pictographs. Small drawings scratched directly into clay. A sheep looked like a sheep. A head of grain looked like a head of grain. A human figure was recognizable as such, if only barely. This worked well enough for inventories, but it collapsed the moment anyone tried to record something that could not be drawn. How do you sketch the concept of debt? How do you illustrate a promise or a legal boundary or the phrase to be delivered after the next harvest? The answer the Sumerians arrived at was a cognitive leap so significant that its consequences are still unfolding. They began using symbols not to represent things but to represent sounds. In Sumerian, the word ti means both arrow and life. The pictograph for an arrow easily drawn, widely recognized, could therefore stand in for the sound to you wherever it appeared, regardless of whether the intended meaning had anything to do with arrows. A symbol that once pointed at the world now pointed at language itself, and with that shift the entire range of human speech became writable. Laws, medical instructions, personal letters, religious hymns, complaints about a neighbour's goat, love poems, tax records, shopping lists. Anything that could be said could now be set down in clay and read back by someone who had never heard the original speaker's voice. The cost of this breakthrough was complexity. The mature cuneiform system contained roughly 2,000 distinct signs, later reduced to a still formidable 600 in common use. Each sign could carry multiple meanings depending on context. Some signs represented whole words, some represented syllables, some represented categories. A determinative sign placed before a word to indicate whether it referred to a person, a city, a god, a type of wood. There were no consistent rules that a beginner could memorize and apply universally. Mastery required years of repetition correction and a tolerance for ambiguity that would test the patience of any modern student. The boys, and they were almost exclusively boys drawn from families wealthy enough to pay tuition and spare a child's labour, entered the scribble schools at roughly 7 years of age and did not emerge as competent writers until their mid-teens. Full expertise came later, still in adulthood, after a decade or more of daily practice, under teachers whose pedagogical method leaned heavily on repetition, and when repetition failed on physical correction, applied without much ceremony to the back of the head or the flat of the shoulders. A Sumerian text survives. Scholars sometimes call it school days, in which a student recounts a single day's experience in the Aduba the scribal school. He arrives late and is beaten. He speaks out of turn and is beaten. His handwriting is judged sloppy and he is beaten. He stands when he should sit and is beaten. The litany continues with a persistence that would be comic if it were not so plainly a description of actual practice. The student's solution is revealing he asks his father to invite the headmaster home for dinner, where gifts are presented, a new garment, a ring extra food, and the teacher's assessment of the boy's work improves markedly by the following day. It is as far as anyone can determine the earliest recorded instance of a parent attempting to influence a teacher's grading through hospitality, and the fact that the text survived suggests it resonated with enough readers to be copied and preserved across generations. The detail is small, almost humorous, but it carries weight because it reveals something the administrative tablets do not, that behind the system of signs and records and institutional authority, there were ordinary people navigating social pressures that have not changed as much as we might like to believe. What the scribes produced, however, outlasted every social arrangement that created them. The tablets they pressed and dried and occasionally fired in kilns to ensure permanence became an archive so vast that modern archaeology has recovered hundreds of thousands of them, with more emerging from the soil every decade, and the story those tablets tell reaches far beyond sheep counts and grain receipts into the law courts, the temples and the marketplaces where Sumerian life played out in terms that were beneath the strangeness, startlingly specific. What barley could buy. How do you conduct an economy without coins? The question sounds almost rhetorical from the vantage point of a world saturated with currency. But in Sumer it was not a question at all. It was simply the way things worked and had worked for as long as anyone could remember, and would continue to work for another 2,000 years before the first standardized coinage appeared in a kingdom far to the west. In the marketplaces of southern Mesopotamia, the unit of exchange was grain, barley specifically. You carried it in a pouch or a small sack. You measured it out in standardized volumes, the sila roughly equivalent to a litre, and you handed it over in quantities negotiated face to face, voice against voice, in a process of haggling so ingrained in daily commerce that the Sumerian language developed specific vocabulary for the stages of a deal: the opening offer, the counter, the feigned insult, the grudging acceptance, the final weighing on a balance scale to confirm that neither party had shorted the other. Silver existed for larger transactions, land purchases, major contracts, temple obligations, but most people never touched it. Their economy ran on grain, and grain ran on trust, and trust ran on the understanding that the person standing across from you at the vegetable stall would be standing there again tomorrow and the day after, and that reputation in a city of 10,000 people was not easily rebuilt once lost. The marketplace itself occupied a broad open area near the city gate, shaded by wooden stalls and reed awnings that offered partial relief from the sun without doing much about the heat, radiating upward from the baked ground beneath. The noise was considerable. Vendors called out descriptions of their goods in voices pitched to carry over the general commotion. Buyers moved between stalls, comparing quality, testing firmness, sniffing for freshness, in a world without refrigeration where the difference between edible and dangerous could narrow over the course of a single afternoon. Baskets of grain sat alongside hanging bundles of dried fish, clay jars of sesame oil, sealed with cloth stoppers, stacks of flatbread still warm from nearby ovens, bundles of onions and garlic tied with reed cord, woven textiles in varying grades of fineness, leather sandals, copper tools displayed with the careful pride of a craftsman who knows his work is expensive and wants you to understand why. The smell was a layered thing, roasting meat and fresh bread and dried fish and tanned leather, and the sharp mineral scent of hot metal from a nearby workshop, all of it underlaid by the constant human warmth of several hundred people conducting business in close quarters under a sun that showed no sign of moderating. Among the goods that moved through these markets, some had travelled distances that seem improbable for a world without paved roads or motorised transport. Shells from the Persian Gulf coast arrived after weeks of overland or riverine travel. Timber from the cedar forests of Lebanon, a commodity southern Mesopotamia lacked entirely, having almost no native trees suitable for construction, came down trade routes that crossed hundreds of miles of varied and sometimes hostile terrain. Copper arrived from Anatolia to the north. Lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone prized for jewellery and decorative inlay, made a journey of extraordinary length from the mountains of what is now northeastern Afghanistan, passing through multiple intermediary hands before reaching a Sumerian craftsman's workshop. The trade networks that supplied these cities operated across thousands of miles in an era when a 15-mile march to the neighbouring city-state constituted a full day's effort, and the fact that they functioned at all, that lapis lazuli moved reliably from Afghan mountains to Mesopotamian temples, suggests a degree of long-distance commercial organisation that the cuneiform record confirms but does not fully explain. What the record does capture in detail is the local economy and particularly the institution that sat at its centre, the temple. The ziggurat complex was not merely a place of worship or even a centre of government. It was in economic terms the largest employer, the largest landowner, the largest warehouse and the largest distributor of goods in the city. Temple accounts preserved on thousands of clay tablets track the movement of commodities with a precision that borders on obsessive. Every sheep born in the temple flock was recorded. Every jar of oil pressed from temple-owned sesame fields was tallied. Every beer ration distributed to a canal worker was noted by name and amount. The scribes who managed these accounts were not performing ritual work. They were performing logistics, and the scale of what they tracked suggests an operation employing hundreds of people, priests, administrators, craftsmen, labourers, servants, guards, all of whom needed to be fed, clothed, housed, and compensated from the temple's accumulated stores. A single tablet from the city of Ur records the distribution of barley rations to individual workers for a period of 1 month, and the list runs to dozens of names, each followed by a precise quantity, each entry a small confirmation that this person showed up, did their work, and received what they were owed. It is not poetry, it is payroll, and yet there is something in its patient specificity in the fact that someone sat in a cool room and carefully noted that this particular worker received this particular amount on this particular day, that speaks to the organisational depth these cities had achieved, and to the degree to which civilization at its most fundamental level is an act of accounting. But the marketplace and the temple ledger tell only part of the story. What they do not capture, what no economic record fully captures, is the texture of the lives lived within the system, the social distances between the scribe who recorded the rations and the labourer who received them, between the copper merchant displaying tools most people could never afford, and the woman negotiating the price of onions with grain measured from a pouch that would be empty before the week was out. Sumer had a hierarchy, and it was not subtle, and it shaped everything from what you ate to how you died. A structure we can trace most clearly not in the marketplace, but in the laws that governed what happened when the ordinary transactions of life went wrong. What the record does not settle. If the story of Sumer were as clean as it is sometimes presented, the first civilization the inventors of writing the origin point from which all subsequent human organization flows there, would be less to say about it, and paradoxically less reason to find it interesting. The complications are what give the record its texture, and it is worth pausing here at the midpoint of this account to acknowledge some of them honestly, not because they diminish what the Sumerians built, but because taking them seriously is the only way to understand what they built with any accuracy. The claim that Sumer represents the first civilization depends entirely on what the word civilization is taken to mean. If the definition requires urban settlement combined with writing, then Sumer holds a strong position in the earliest cuneiform tablets, and the earliest large-scale city architecture appear in southern Mesopotamia within a few centuries of each other, and no other region has produced evidence of both at comparably early dates. But if the definition is broadened to include complex social organisation, monumental construction, long-distance trade and hierarchical governance, without necessarily requiring a writing system, then the picture becomes less tidy. The Indus Valley centres of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, dating to roughly 2600 BC, display urban planning of remarkable sophistication, standardised brick sizes, grid, patterned streets, elaborate drainage systems without any writing system that modern scholars have been able to decipher, which may mean they had none, or may mean we simply cannot read what they left behind. Ancient Egypt unified under a single ruler around 3100 BC, roughly contemporaneous with the earliest Sumerian city-states, and developed its own hieroglyphic script independently. The site of Caral Soup in coastal Peru shows evidence of monumental architecture and complex society dating to around 3000 BC in a hemisphere entirely disconnected from Mesopotamian influence. None of this erases Sumer's achievements. It does, however, suggest that the phrase first civilization functions less as a settled historical fact and more as a convenient shorthand that smooths over a considerable amount of ongoing scholarly debate. A second area of uncertainty concerns the specific innovations commonly attributed to the Sumerians: the wheel, the ploughbeer soap, formal education. The impulse to assign each of these a single point of origin is understandable. It makes for a clean narrative, and the Sumerian record, being the earliest literate record, naturally captures the earliest written references to many technologies. But the earliest written reference to something is not necessarily the same as its invention. Beer fermentation, for instance, is a process that can occur spontaneously under the right conditions, and it may well have been discovered independently in multiple regions before any Sumerian scribe thought to mention it on a tablet. The plough appears in the Sumerian record as an established tool, not as a new invention, which suggests it may have developed gradually across a wide area rather than springing from a single moment of insight in a single Mesopotamian field. The word invented carries an implication of singular origin that the archaeological evidence does not always support, and using it without qualification risks turning a complex distributed process of human innovation into a simpler story than the evidence warrants. Then there is the question of the Pythagorean theorem, or rather the question of what the Sumerians actually knew about the relationship between the sides of a right triangle. The claim that appears in popular accounts, and which surfaces in this narrative as well, is that the Sumerians understood this relationship 1,000 years before Pythagoras. The evidence most frequently cited is a clay tablet known as Plimpton 322, which lists sets of numbers that correspond to Pythagorean triples, combinations of three integers, where the square of the largest equals the sum of the squares of the other two. The tablet is real, well-documented, and genuinely impressive. It is also Babylonian, not Sumerian, dating to approximately 1800 BC, the Old Babylonian period, more than 1,000 years after the height of Sumerian political independence. The Babylonians inherited and extended Sumerian mathematical traditions, so there is a lineage, but attributing Plimpton 322 directly to the Sumerians collapses a millennium of mathematical development into a single label in a way that obscures more than it clarifies. Furthermore, listing Pythagorean triples is not the same as proving a general theorem. The tablet demonstrates practical knowledge of specific numerical relationships. Whether its creators understood the underlying principle as a universal rule, the way Euclid later formalized it in Greek mathematical tradition, remains a matter of interpretation rather than certainty. These are not objections designed to diminish. They are calibrations, small adjustments to the lens through which the Sumerian achievement is viewed, intended to bring the image into sharper focus, rather than to blur it. The irrigation systems are real. The cuneiform archive is vast and largely consistent. The social organization required to build and maintain these cities across centuries of environmental instability is not in serious dispute. What changes when the skeptical points are acknowledged is not the substance of the achievement, but its framing. Sumer becomes less a single miraculous origin point and more a participant, an early and extraordinary participant, but a participant nonetheless in a broader human pattern of independent innovation, parallel development and gradual accumulation that was unfolding across multiple regions of the world simultaneously. The Sumerians did not invent civilization in the way that a single person invents a machine. They were among the first to assemble a particular combination of elements: urbanization, writing, centralized administration, large-scale agriculture, in a way that left a record legible enough for us to study 5,000 years later. That is remarkable on its own terms, without needing the additional weight of being called the first or the only. And perhaps that is the more honest frame, not a single origin, but an early and vivid example of what happens when human communities reach a certain density, face a certain set of pressures, and begin to organize their responses in ways that generate complexity, almost as a byproduct of survival. The pressures in Sumer were specific heat, unpredictable rivers, limited natural resources and neighbours close enough to see from the top of a ziggurat. How those pressures shaped not just the infrastructure, but the people who lived within it. Their bodies, their families, their brief and precarious lives is a question. The record answers, in terms that are beneath the distance of 5 millennia, unexpectedly personal. The weight of the law, somewhere in the archive of recovered cuneiform tablets among the grain receipts, and the astronomical observations and the hymns to gods whose names have not been spoken aloud in 4,000 years, there are legal documents, thousands of them, contracts for the sale of land recorded in careful signs with the names of witnesses pressed into the clay beside the terms of the agreement, divorce proceedings specifying who keeps the house, who keeps the children, who owes what to whom, loan records noting the amount of grain borrowed, the interest rate, the date by which repayment is due, and the penalty, usually labour, for failure to meet the obligation, and trial transcripts brief but specific, in which an accusation is stated, a defence is offered or not offered, and a verdict is rendered by the NC, or a council of elders whose authority derives from a combination of age status and proximity to the divine. The Sumerians did not merely have laws. They wrote them down, carved them into stone, displayed them in public spaces, and treated them as fixed reference points rather than flexible suggestions, a practice so fundamental to their understanding of order that it survived essentially unchanged in principle through every empire that followed them in Mesopotamia. The earliest known legal code is not Hammurabi's. That distinction belongs to the Code of Ur-Nammu, compiled around 2100 BC during the Third Dynasty of Ur, roughly 3.5 centuries before Hammurabi mounted his more famous version on a polished stone stela in Babylon. An even earlier fragment, the Code of Lipit Ishtar, survives from approximately 1934 BC. The Sumerian legal tradition was already old by the time Hammurabi inherited it, and what he produced, comprehensive as it was, represents a refinement of principles that had been developing in the river valleys for generations. The laws themselves cover an astonishing range of human situations, property disputes naturally, assault and its graduated penalties, theft from a temple versus theft from a private citizen with different consequences for each, agricultural regulations specifying what happens when your ox injures someone else's ox, or when irrigation water from your field damages a neighbour's crop, marriage contracts detailing the obligations of both parties and the conditions under which either could seek dissolution, inheritance rules that attempted with varying success to prevent the fragmentation of family estates across multiple heirs. The specificity is what strikes a modern reader, not the broad principles which are familiar enough, but the granular attention to situations so particular that they suggest real disputes, real grievances, real people standing before an authority and demanding that their case be heard. The punishments prescribed in these codes are by modern standards severe. Mutilation appears with uncomfortable frequency, a hand removed for theft, an eye taken for an eye lost, a tongue cut for perjury. Whether these penalties were applied as written, or whether they functioned more as maximums that could be reduced at the discretion of the presiding authority, is a question the record does not entirely resolve. Some trial accounts describe sentences considerably lighter than the code would seem to demand temple service, in place of amputation fines, in place of physical harm, which suggests either that the judges exercised discretion, or that the written law served partly as a deterrent, its harshest provisions intended to frighten more than to be routinely enforced. The inconsistency may seem like a flaw, but it also resembles something familiar, the gap between what a legal code prescribes and what a court actually does, which is a feature of virtually every legal system that has existed since, including the ones operating at this moment in cities where the word Sumer has never been spoken aloud. What the legal tablets reveal most clearly, however, is not the mechanics of justice, but the social architecture that justice was designed to protect. Sumerian society arranged itself in layers that were explicit, well understood, and largely immovable. At the top sat the Ensi and his family holding political and religious authority, in a combination that made the two nearly indistinguishable. Just below them, the priesthood literate educated, claiming direct communication with the divine, managing the temple's vast economic operations with an expertise that made them indispensable to anyone who wished to govern. Below the priests, a class of merchants and skilled craftsmen, potters, metalworkers, jewellers, weavers who owned their workshops, lived in decent houses and occupied a social position that was comfortable without being powerful. Below them, the broad base of the hierarchy, farmers and labourers, the people who dug the canals, planted the fields, carried the bricks and performed the physical work on which everything above them rested. They were paid in rations, barley bread, beer, occasionally fish or dates measured out in amounts sufficient to sustain life, and insufficient to accumulate anything resembling surplus. And at the bottom, slaves. People captured in war, convicted of crimes, or driven by debt to sell themselves into servitude. They held no legal standing. They were property listed in inventories alongside livestock and furniture, and the laws that governed their treatment were concerned less with their welfare than with the rights of their owners. The distance between the top and bottom of this hierarchy was not merely economic. It was physical, visible, embedded in the texture of daily life in ways that no one could overlook. The Ensi wore garments of fine wool with decorative fringe. The labourer wore a rough rectangle of linen held in place with a cord. The priest ate roasted lamb and honeyed barley at temple ceremonies. The canal worker ate plain porridge and flatbread and drank beer that, while nutritious, was thick enough to require a straw. The scribe sat indoors in shade, pressing a stylus into clay. The brick carrier worked outside in heat that could kill lifting loads that compressed his spine a little more with every year. These were not subtle differences. They were the organising principle of the entire society, as visible as the ziggurat itself, and in their own way just as deliberately constructed. And yet the hierarchy was not entirely sealed. There existed within this rigid structure a single narrow passage through which a person born at the bottom might ascend not to the top perhaps, but to a position considerably above where they began. That passage ran through the Scrabble schools through years of memorization and beatings and patient practice, and it led to the one profession in Sumer where the tool of your trade weighed less than an ounce, and the sun never touched your back while you worked. But education required resources most families did not have, and for those who remained outside its reach, the shape of a life was largely determined at birth, a pattern the Sumerians did not invent, but did perhaps formalize more explicitly than anyone before them, setting it down in the same cuneiform script they used for everything else, as though even inequality deserved proper documentation. The distance between cities, 15 miles. That is roughly the distance between one Sumerian city-state and the next. Close enough that on a clear day, standing on the upper platform of your city's ziggurat, you could see the smudge of a neighbouring settlement on the horizon, its own stepped temple rising faintly against the flat sky like a mirror image of your own. 15 miles of irrigated fields, date palm groves, and canal networks separated communities that shared the same language, the same gods, the same agricultural techniques, the same writing system, and the same fundamental dependence on water drawn from the same two rivers, and yet that distance small enough to walk in a single day, small enough that trade goods and marriage partners and religious pilgrims crossed it, routinely was also the distance across which wars were fought. With a regularity that suggests proximity in the absence of any binding authority above the city level, generates friction almost as reliably as it generates exchange. The trigger was nearly always water. When a city upstream built a new canal or expanded an existing one, the volume of water reaching cities downstream diminished. Fields that had been adequately irrigated began to receive less. Crops that had grown reliably began to falter. The mathematics of the situation were stark and left little room for diplomatic nuance. Water diverted into one city's fields was water subtracted from another's, and in a landscape where the margin between adequate harvest and famine was already thin, even a modest reduction could push a community past the threshold of survival. Ambassadors were sent, demands were made, compromises were attempted, and sometimes they held, and sometimes they did not. And when they did not, the resolution followed a pattern that repeated across centuries with a consistency that might be called tradition, if the word did not carry more warmth than the process deserved. The institution that managed warfare in Sumer was distinct from the institution that managed everything else, and that distinction matters. The NC, the city's administrative and religious leader, the figure who oversaw the temple economy, organised canal labour and served as the god's representative in civic affairs, was not primarily a military commander. When threats arose that required armed response, authority shifted to a different figure, the legale, a title that translates roughly as big man, denoting a war leader chosen for the specific purpose of directing the city's defence or when the occasion demanded its aggression. The arrangement was originally temporary. The Lugal was selected during a crisis, granted expanded powers for the duration of that crisis, and expected to relinquish those powers once the danger had passed, returning governance to the Enase and the council of elders who advised him. It was in its earliest form something that resembled collective decision-making, not democracy in any modern sense, but a system in which permanent military authority was viewed with enough suspicion that it was deliberately constrained by design. The design did not hold. Wars came too frequently, crises overlapped, and the Lugal who had been granted temporary command found that the same qualities that made him effective in battle decisiveness, the loyalty of armed men, a willingness to act without consultation, also made him difficult to dislodge once the fighting stopped. Some Lugals simply refused to step down. Others arranged for new threats to emerge real or exaggerated that justified the continuation of their authority. Over time, the position became permanent, then hereditary, passing from father to son in a transformation so gradual that by the time it was complete, the original temporary arrangement had been replaced by something that looked very much like kingship, with the Lugal's family constituting a ruling dynasty, and the Ensi reduced to a subordinate administrative role. The pattern emergency powers granted temporarily retained, permanently and eventually inherited is not unique to Sumer. It recurs across civilizations with a frequency that suggests something structural about the relationship between military authority and political power, something that the Sumerians encountered early and resolved in a direction that every subsequent empire would find familiar. The army the Lugal commanded was not for the most part professional. A small corps of trained warriors, perhaps 100 men in a city of 10,000, served as the Lugal's personal guard, equipped with bronze weapons, copper helmets and leather armour, reinforced with metal studs. These were skilled fighters, drilled and experienced, and they formed the leading edge of any military action. Everyone else was conscripted. Farmers pulled from their fields, labourers pulled from the canals, craftsmen pulled from their workshops, ordinary men handed a wooden spear with a fire-hardened tip, a shield of woven reed stretched over a wooden frame, and instructions that amounted to little more than staying close to the man in front of you, and pointing the sharp end at anyone who wasn't from your city. Training was minimal, equipment was inadequate. The experience of combat for these conscripts was not the organised clash of disciplined formations, but something closer to a terrifying improvisation, conducted at close range with edged tools against people who a few weeks earlier had been doing the same canal work in a city that looked almost exactly like yours. The battles themselves were brief and brutal. Siege warfare in this period was rudimentary ladders against walls' rocks, thrown from rooftops, attempts to breach gates that were thick timber reinforced with bronze bands. The fighting that followed a successful breach took place in narrow streets between mud brick houses, at ranges so close that the distinction between combat and simple violence effectively disappeared. Casualties were significant on both sides. An infection in an era without antiseptics, without any understanding of bacterial contamination, without anything beyond herbal pastes and priestly incantations, to treat open wounds killed more of the injured in the days following a battle than the weapons themselves had killed during it. A spear graze that would be a minor inconvenience in a modern emergency room was in Sumer a potentially fatal injury, whose outcome depended on factors no one present could identify, let alone control. The aftermath of a successful campaign followed its own grim logic. The defeated city's ruler was forced to kneel and swear allegiance. Tribute was imposed, grain, silver, livestock labour. Prisoners were taken and marched back to the victorious city, where they entered the lowest tier of the social hierarchy as slaves performing the heaviest and most dangerous work, for no compensation beyond the minimum sustenance required to keep them functional. The Lugal who had led the campaign received praise offerings, songs composed in his honour by temple scribes, whose enthusiasm for the subject was likely enhanced by an awareness of who was now signing their ration tablets. And the conscripted farmer who had survived the fighting went home, lay down on his reed mat and stared at the ceiling, with the knowledge that his hands had done something they could not undo, and that the canal work waiting for him in the morning would feel for a while at least like mercy. But the wars between neighbouring cities, devastating as they were, remained local conflicts between communities separated by 15 miles of irrigated plain fought over water rights and grazing land, and the pride of rival Lugals. What came next operated on a different scale, entirely arriving from the north, in the person of a man whose origin story reads less like history, and more like the template for every unlikely rise to power that followed. The man in the basket. His mother, according to the legend, was a priestess, a woman of high temple rank who became pregnant under circumstances that her position did not permit. The solution she chose, or the solution the story assigns to her, was to place the infant in a basket woven from reeds, seal it with bitumen to keep the water out, and set it adrift on the Euphrates River. A gardener working along the banks found the basket, opened it, and raised the child as his own. The child grew up, entered the service of the king of Kish as a cupbearer, the official who poured the ruler's drinks, a role that carried no military authority, but placed its holder within arm's reach of power on a daily basis, and then at some point that the record does not date with precision, overthrew the king seized control of the city and began a campaign of conquest that would not stop until it had produced the first known empire in human history. His name was Sargon, and the story of his birth has a quality that should make any careful listener pause, because it is not the only story of its kind. A child of hidden origin, placed in a vessel on a river, rescued by a humble figure rising to extraordinary power. The pattern appears again in later traditions, most famously in the account of Moses and its recurrence across cultures, and centuries suggests that it may function less as biography and more as a narrative formula signalling divine favour and destined greatness. Whether Sargon was actually placed in a basket on the Euphrates is something the evidence cannot confirm. What the evidence does confirm is what he did after the story says he was found. Sargon did not remain in Kish. He built a new capital, Akkad or Agade, a city whose precise location has never been identified, despite more than a century of archaeological search, which is itself a peculiar detail for the seat of the world's first empire. From a caird, he launched military campaigns in every direction, with a speed and scale that had no precedent in Mesopotamian experience. The Sumerian city-states fell one after another, not destroyed, but subordinated their emphasis left nominally in place, but shadowed by Akkadian governors whose presence ensured that local decisions aligned with Sargon's interests. Grain surpluses that had previously stayed within the city were now partially redirected to Akkad. Soldiers who had previously fought only for their own Lugal could now be called up to serve in Sargon's wars. The autonomy that had defined Sumerian political life for centuries, each city-state governing itself, answering to no authority beyond its own walls and its own gods, evaporated within a generation, replaced by a centralized system in which one ruler's will extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, from the Zagros Mountains to the edges of Anatolia. The mechanics of this empire were, by the standards of what came before, remarkably sophisticated. Sargon stationed garrisons of troops in conquered territories to discourage rebellion. He appointed governors drawn from his own trusted circle, rather than relying entirely on local elites whose loyalty was uncertain. He established what appears to have been a postal system relay stations along major routes where messages could be transferred between riders, allowing information to travel across the empire faster than any individual could walk or ride. He standardized weights and measures so that a unit of grain in one province meant the same thing as a unit of grain in another, reducing the opportunities for fraud and simplifying the administration of tribute. He built roads, or improved existing ones, connecting the empire's major centers in a network that facilitated both trade and the rapid movement of military forces. The organizational intelligence behind these systems is considerable, and it is worth noting that none of them were invented from nothing. They built on Sumerian administrative traditions, on the cuneiform record-keeping that made large-scale management possible, on the canal maintenance logistics that had already demonstrated how thousands of workers could be coordinated across a wide landscape. Sargon's genius, if that is the right word, was not in creating these tools, but in recognizing that they could operate at a scale no one had previously attempted. The empire reached its greatest extent under Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin, who took ambition a step further than even his grandfather had ventured. Naram-Sin declared himself not merely a king blessed by the gods, but a god himself, a living deity, entitled to the horned crown that was the symbol of divinity in Mesopotamian iconography. The declaration was unprecedented. Previous rulers had claimed divine favor, divine appointment, divine protection. None had claimed to be divine in their own person. The priests whose authority rested on their role as intermediaries between humans and gods viewed the claim with something between alarm and outrage. A ruler who was himself a god had no need for priestly intercession, and a theology that placed a living man among the deities threatened the entire structure of religious authority that had sustained the temple system for centuries. Naram-Sin did not appear to find their objections persuasive. He adopted the title King of the Four Corners of the World, commissioned victory monuments depicting himself at superhuman scale, wearing the horned crown, and crushed the rebellions that his self-deification provoked, with a military efficiency that left little room for theological debate. But there is a pattern in Mesopotamian history visible already, even this early, in which the expansion of power carries within it the conditions of its own reversal. The Akkadian Empire under Naram-Sin controlled more territory, more resources, more trade routes than any political entity before it. Its administrative systems were proven, its military was experienced, its ruler claimed the authority of a god. And yet within a generation of Naram-Sin's death, the entire structure would begin to collapse, not from the centre, but from the edges, where the mountains met the plain, and a people the Akkadians had barely thought about were watching the lowland cities with an attention that had recently sharpened into something more purposeful than curiosity. When the canals went quiet. The Gutians came from the Zagros Mountains to the east, a people the lowland scribes described with the kind of language that civilizations reserve for those they consider beneath classification. Herders-raiders, mountain dwellers who kept livestock in high pastures and moved with the seasons across terrain that no Akkadian army could navigate with confidence. For years they had been a nuisance, nothing more. Small raiding parties descended from the foothills to strike border settlements, seizing grain and livestock, before disappearing back into valleys where pursuit was impractical, and the advantage of terrain belonged entirely to the people who had grown up walking it. The Akkadian military responded with punitive expeditions, columns of soldiers marching into the mountains to inflict damage and discourage further raids. The expeditions went badly. The Gutians knew every pass, every ridge, every narrow defile, where an ambush could turn an organised column into a scattered collection of men fighting uphill against opponents who had chosen the ground. The lowland army retreated, regrouped, tried again, retreated again. The raids continued, grew bolder, and somewhere around 2200 BC crossed a threshold that transformed them from a border problem into something the empire could not survive. A Gutian leader named Eridupazir brought a force out of the mountains that was no longer a raiding party but an army organised, numerous, and aimed directly at the heartland of Mesopotamia. The Akkadian forces met them and lost. The defeat was not a close thing that might have gone either way with better luck or different weather. It was decisive enough that Eridupazir was able to advance into the sacred city of Nippur and have his victory carved into stone there in the religious centre of the Sumerian world as a permanent record that the people who had controlled this land for generations could no longer defend it. The symbolism was as deliberate as it was devastating. Nippur was not merely a city. It was the seat of Enlil, the most powerful active god in the Mesopotamian pantheon, the deity whose favour was considered essential for any legitimate rule. To hold Nippur was to hold in theological terms the franchise of divine approval and the fact that a mountain people with no cuneiform, no ziggurat tradition, and no apparent interest in Mesopotamian theology now occupied that space sent a signal through the region that the old order had fractured in a way that could not be repaired by simply winning the next battle. The empire did not fall all at once. It crumbled in stages the way a canal bank erodes slowly at first, then in sudden collapses that reveal how much of the underlying structure had already been hollowed out. Provincial governors stopped sending tribute to Akkad. Local rulers who had submitted under Sargon's shadow began reasserting independence, calculating that a weakened centre could no longer enforce compliance. The Gutians pushed deeper into the lowlands, taking more cities, more territory, installing their own leaders in positions of authority over communities they did not understand and could not effectively administer. And it was this last problem, not the military conquest itself, but what followed it, that turned a political collapse into something closer to a civilizational one. The Gutians were mountain people. Their expertise was in herding animals across highland pastures, in reading weather patterns over ridgelines, in surviving winters at elevation. They had no experience with irrigation agriculture. They did not understand the canal systems that made lowland farming possible, the delicate balance of water distribution, the constant maintenance, the coordinated labour required to keep silt from choking channels that entire cities depended on for survival. And when they assumed control of a region whose existence was built entirely on those systems, they inherited an infrastructure they could not operate. The comparison is imperfect, but it carries a recognisable truth. It was as though someone had been handed the controls of a machine whose function they could observe but whose maintenance they had never learned. And the machine lacking maintenance began to fail in ways that compounded with each passing season. Canals silted up, banks eroded without repair. Water distribution became erratic, some fields flooded while others dried out. Crops failed not because of drought or natural disaster, but because the human systems that mediated between the rivers and the fields had lost the people who knew how to run them. Food shortages began, then deepened into famine. Disease followed famine, as it always does when populations weaken from malnutrition and crowd together in diminishing habitable space. The economy contracted. Trade routes that had carried lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and timber from Lebanon fell silent, as merchants found the roads unsafe and the markets unable to pay. Craftsmen who had depended on imported materials, copper, stone, quality timber could no longer obtain them. Cities that had thrived as commercial hubs began to shrivel, their populations declining, as people fled to wherever they believed survival was more likely. Some headed south toward the marshlands, where traditional Sumerian life persisted in smaller, more isolated communities. Some headed north. Many simply died of hunger, of disease, of the accumulated consequences of systems failing in sequence, each failure triggering the next in a chain that no single intervention could arrest. The period that followed is sometimes called the First Dark Age of Mesopotamia, and the label, while dramatic, is not entirely inaccurate. Population estimates for southern Mesopotamia during the Gutian period suggest a decline of more than half, though such figures for the ancient world are necessarily approximate, and should be held with the caution that any reconstruction based on fragmentary evidence demands. What is less ambiguous is the archaeological record of abandonment. Whole neighbourhoods in major cities left empty houses crumbling as mud brick exposed to rain and sun without maintenance returned gradually to the earth it had been shaped from. Ziggurats deteriorated. Temple ceremonies grew simpler, then ceased. The elaborate bureaucratic systems that had tracked every sheep and every grain ration fell apart as the scribes who operated them found no institution willing or able to employ them. Tablets were destroyed, repurposed as building material ground into temper for new bricks. Knowledge recorded over centuries was lost, not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic burning, but incrementally, one uncopied tablet at a time, one abandoned archive at a time, in a process so gradual that no single moment could be identified as the point where recovery became impossible. For more than a century this continued, 100 years of fragmentation, decline and suffering that the cuneiform record captures only in glimpses. A lament here, a brief inscription, their references in later texts to a time when order dissolved and the land was without proper rule. But somewhere in the south, in a city that had maintained a thread of continuity through the chaos, a leader was beginning to organize what the region had lacked since the Akkadian collapse, not just resistance, but the possibility that what had been broken could with enough effort and enough coordination be rebuilt. The second chance. The man who drove the Gutians out of Mesopotamia did not live long enough to see what his victory made possible. Utu Hegal, ruler of Uruk, spent years building a coalition among the surviving southern cities, negotiating, persuading, assembling an army from communities that had spent a century enduring occupation and had little reason to trust that collective action would succeed where individual resistance had repeatedly failed. Around 2120 BC he marched north, met the Gutian forces in battle, and won. The occupation ended. The mountain people retreated to the Zagros passes they had come from, and the lowlands, for the first time in over 100 years, were governed again by people who understood what the canals required. Then Utu Hegel drowned. The circumstances recorded in later texts describe a canal accident, which may have been exactly what it was. A man walking along an embankment that gave way, falling into water that moved faster than he could manage, or may have been something less accidental, though the record does not say, and speculation without evidence is a habit best left to traditions less concerned with precision than this one attempts to be. What matters is that Utu Hegel's work did not die with him. His successor, a man named Ur-Nammu, took what the liberation had made possible and built from it something that for a time looked remarkably like renewal. Ur-Nammu founded what historians call the Third Dynasty of Ur, and the scope of what he accomplished in the decades that followed suggests either extraordinary ability or extraordinary circumstances, or most likely both. The canals were repaired, not patched, not temporarily shored up, but systematically restored across the entire network channels, redug banks, reinforced reservoirs, rebuilt the whole intricate mechanism that translated river water into harvested grain, brought back to functional condition after a century of neglect. Cities were rebuilt, markets reopened. Trade routes that had fallen silent during the Gutian period began to carry goods again, not immediately, and not at their former volume, but enough that the craftsmen who depended on imported materials could resume their work, and the economy that depended on exchange could begin to circulate. The ziggurat at Ur, the great stepped pyramid dedicated to Nana the moon, God rose again, its massive mud brick platforms reconstructed on a scale that announced as clearly as any inscription could that the people who built it intended to stay. The administrative system Ur-Nammu established was in its way as impressive as the physical reconstruction. He organized his domain into provinces, each governed by an appointed official who reported to the central authority at Ur. He implemented a tax system called Bala, a rotating schedule, in which each province contributed goods and labour for 1 month of the year, spreading the burden across the calendar so that no single region bore a disproportionate share at any one time. The system was elegant in its simplicity, and effective in its execution, generating the surplus needed to fund public works, maintain the military, and support the temple institutions that served as the administrative backbone of every major city. Ur-Nammu also compiled a legal code, the earliest known predating Hammurabi's by more than 3 centuries, setting down in cuneiform the rules and penalties that governed property injury, marriage, and commerce. The code was not gentle, but it was written public and consistent, which in a region that had spent 100 years without reliable governance represented something close to a restoration of trust in the idea that rules could exist and be enforced. Sumerian was revived as the official language of administration and religion, though by this time the language of daily conversation across much of Mesopotamia had shifted to Akkadian. The distinction is telling. Sumerian became a sacred and scholarly language, the medium of ritual, of legal record, of literary composition, while Akkadian served as the practical tongue of markets and households and ordinary exchange. The arrangement resembles in broad outline the role Latin played in medieval Europe, a language no longer spoken natively, but preserved in institutions that valued continuity with the past, and used the old language as a marker of legitimacy and learning. It was during this period that the Sumerian king list was compiled, that famous document tracing the succession of rulers from mythical antediluvian kings through historical dynasties down to the present. The list is part record and part propaganda linking Ur-Nammu's dynasty to an unbroken chain of authority extending back to the time before the Great Flood, a genealogy of power designed to make the current arrangement feel not just legitimate, but inevitable, as though the third dynasty of Ur was not a new beginning, but a restoration of something that had always been meant to continue. For a time, the restoration held. Cities prospered. The bureaucracy functioned. The canals delivered water, and the fields delivered grain, and the temples delivered the rituals that kept the divine order aligned with the human one. But beneath the surface of this recovery, pressures were accumulating that no administrative system, however well designed, could indefinitely contain. The soil itself was changing. Centuries of irrigation without adequate drainage had allowed dissolved salts to accumulate in the upper layers of farmland, a process called salinization that reduced crop yields gradually and visibly in increments so small that no single season's harvest would have revealed the trend. Some scholars argue this slow poisoning of the agricultural base was the fundamental cause of southern Mesopotamia's eventual decline, not war, not invasion, but the land itself giving less and less in response to the same effort, until the effort could no longer sustain the population it was meant to feed. Others weigh additional factors: political corruption within the bureaucracy, resentment from Akkadian-speaking northern provinces governed by a Sumerian-speaking southern elite, the growing pressure of Amorite nomads pushing in from the western desert, the persistent threat of Elamite aggression from the east. The causes were likely multiple, interacting, and impossible to rank with certainty from a distance of 4,000 years. What is certain is that the third dynasty of Ur did not survive them, and the manner of its ending left behind a document so vivid in its grief that it has outlasted the walls. It mourned a poem composed in the voice of a city watching itself die. What the Clay Remembers. The poem is called The Lament for Ur, and it survives on tablets that were copied and recopied across generations by scribes who understood that what they were preserving was not merely literature but testimony. The text describes the gods withdrawing their protection from the city one by one, deliberately as though departure were a decision rather than an accident. It describes walls, breached streets filled with the dead mothers clutching children, and running toward gates that no longer offered safety. The language is not analytical. It does not explain causes or assign strategic blame. It simply describes what happened to a place where people had lived and worked and raised families and believed themselves protected when that protection ended. On its boulevards, where festivals had been celebrated, the poem says bodies lay scattered. The line does not need commentary. It carries its own weight across 4,000 years without losing any of it. The fall of Ur in 2004, BC conquered by Elamite forces from the east, its last king, Ibi-Sin, taken prisoner. Its temples burned, its granaries emptied, marked the end of Sumerian statehood. There would be no further Sumerian dynasty, no further period in which Sumerian-speaking rulers governed an independent polity. The language continued in temple liturgy and scribal education for centuries afterward, the way a river continues in the channels it carved long after the water itself has been diverted elsewhere. But as a living political entity, as a collection of city-states governed by Entsis and Lugals who answered to Sumerian gods in a Sumerian tongue, it was finished. The Amorites established new dynasties across Mesopotamia. Power shifted north towards cities like Babylon, where a king named Hammurabi would eventually compile his famous legal code on principles the Sumerians had set down 3 centuries earlier. The cuneiform script continued adapted to write Akkadian, and later other languages, its wedge-shaped signs carrying the DNA of a system first developed to count sheep in a temple courtyard. The base 60 number system persisted through Babylonian astronomy and Greek mathematics, and Roman timekeeping and medieval scholarship, and into the clocks and watches and phones that measure your hours today in units a Sumerian accountant would recognize without difficulty. The question of what survives and what does not is never entirely answerable, because survival takes forms that the original creators could not have anticipated. The Sumerians expected their cities to endure. They built their ziggurats from millions of bricks and maintained them with constant labour, believing that the structures would stand as long as the gods required habitation. The ziggurats did not endure, not as functioning temples, not as centres of worship, but the ziggurat at still stands as a ruin, eroded and partially reconstructed its lower platforms, solid enough that a visitor can climb the same stairs Sumerian priests climbed and look out across the same flat landscape, altered by millennia but recognisable in its essential character. The tablets survived better than the buildings. Hundreds of thousands of them sit in museum collections and university archives around the world, at the British Museum, at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, at dozens of smaller institutions, each one a small rectangle of clay carrying marks that a trained reader can still interpret. The accounts of sheep, the contracts for land, the school exercises with the teacher's corrections at the margin, the hymns to Ninkasi that double as brewing instructions, the laments for cities that fell, the mathematical tables that demonstrate knowledge of relationships between numbers that would not be formally named for another millennium. Each tablet is a fragment, and no fragment tells the whole story, but taken together, they compose a portrait of a civilization that is detailed enough to feel at moments almost intimate, close enough that the distance of 5,000 years compresses into something smaller, something that allows a person lying in a quiet room in the present to sense, however faintly, the presence of people who face their own version of the fundamental human problems, and responded with tools and systems and stories that we are still in ways we do not always recognize using. The Sumerians did not know they were building a foundation. They were solving immediate problems: how to move water from a river to a field, how to record a debt, how to predict when the moon would darken, how to keep a city fed through a season of uncertain rainfall. The solutions they found were practical, local, addressed to the pressures of a specific landscape and a specific moment. That those solutions proved transferable, that the writing system adapted to new languages, that the mathematics travelled to new continents, that the legal principles reappeared in codes compiled by rulers who had never heard the word. Sumer was not part of any plan. It was a consequence unintended and unforeseeable of the fact that good solutions to fundamental problems tend to persist regardless of who first devised them. The Sumerians did not set out to start civilization. They set out to survive a difficult place, and what they built in the process of surviving turned out to be durable enough to outlast everything they thought they were building it for. The clay remembers what the cities could not hold, and what it remembers carried forward through every hand that copied a tablet, every student who learned a sign, every culture that inherited a number or a story or a way of dividing the hour reaches all the way to the quiet room where you're resting, now connected across a distance that is not as vast as it appears to people who slept on reed mats and drank beer through straws and have watched the same stars wheel overhead in patterns they were the first to name. A clay tablet roughly the size of a human palm under low glass light. The wedge-shaped marks are still legible rows of small impressions recording the count of sheep belonging to a temple that no longer stands in a city whose name most people passing through the museum gallery will never learn to pronounce. The scribe who pressed those marks worked quickly, You can tell from the depth of certain signs the slight unevenness where the stylus was angled in haste, the places where wet clay accepted the reed a fraction too deeply, because the hand behind it was already moving toward the next line. He was not composing something for the ages. He was finishing a task before the midday heat made the workroom unbearable, and the clay dried under his fingers, and the record held, and 5,000 years later, the tally is still correct. The sheep were counted. The number stands. The hand that wrote it is dust, and the dust is older than most of the languages currently spoken on Earth, and still the count holds. We have followed a long thread tonight, from the reed mat on a packed earth floor to the canal banks where silt was scooped in baskets under a sun that offered no negotiation through the stepped platforms of a ziggurat built to close a gap between the human and the divine, into the quiet rooms where children learned to press meaning into clay and emerged years later carrying a skill that would outlast the walls of every city they served. We traced the grid of a marketplace where barley measured out in handfuls could purchase onions and beer, and on rare occasions a shell carried overland from a coast 3 weeks distant. We watched power consolidate in the hands of war leaders who were meant to be temporary and became permanent, and we saw an empire rise from a story about a baby in a basket and collapse under the weight of mountains it had underestimated. We sat with the silence that followed the century when canals went quiet, and knowledge recorded on clay was ground into the bricks of houses built by people who no longer had anyone to read to them. Not all of it is certain. The dates carry margins of error that widen the further back they reach. The population figures are estimates built on estimates. The motivations attributed to kings and priests and labourers are reconstructions, careful ones, informed by evidence, but reconstructions nonetheless shaped by the questions modern scholars thought to ask, and limited by the questions they did not. Some of what the Sumerians are credited with inventing, they may have inherited from predecessors whose records, if they existed, have not survived. Some of what appears to be uniquely theirs may have developed independently in other regions, in other river valleys, among other people facing other versions of the same fundamental pressures. The record is vast, but it is not complete, and the gaps in it are not empty. They are filled with possibility, with the quiet acknowledgement that what we know is built on what was preserved, and what was preserved is only a fraction of what existed, and what existed was only a fraction of what was experienced by people whose inner lives left no impression in clay. That incompleteness is not a failure. It may be the most honest thing about the whole endeavour, this attempt to understand across a distance of 5 millennia how a scattered collection of settlements in a brutally hot river valley became something that had not existed before, and that once it existed proved impossible to fully undo. The writing spread, the mathematics travelled. The way we divide an hour into 60 minutes and a circle into 360 degrees persists as a quiet inheritance from people who counted on their finger segments and found the number 60 convenient. They did not know they were setting a standard. They were solving a problem that was in front of them, and the solution worked, and it kept working long after the problem, and the people who faced it had disappeared into the silt. Perhaps that is enough to hold for now, not a conclusion the evidence does not ask for one and the hour does not require it, but a recognition that the distance between their world and yours, enormous as it is, narrows in certain places to something almost bridgeable. They watched these same stars, they measured these same angles, they told a story about a flood and a boat, and a man who survived because he listened when a god whispered a warning, and that story crossed languages and centuries and continents, and is still in some form being told tonight somewhere to someone who has never heard the word Sumer. Let that be where this rests. The tablet under glass, the count that held, the hand that moved on to the next line without knowing it was writing something permanent. You have followed this thread a long way, traveller, and the quiet that waits on the other side of these words has been patient. The reed mat and the mud brick walls and the heat of a Mesopotamian dawn belong to the night now yours to carry or to set down as sleep decides. The clay remembers. You do not need to. Close your eyes. Let the stars turn without you for a while. The record is safe. The count still holds. And the morning when it comes will find you resting in a world their effort helped to shape, whether or not you dream of how it started.